Hey, what's up? You're here today with Nick the Informative Fisherman, and today I'd like to talk about the debate that's going on with the crankbaits and the line choices versus your deep divers, where most guys are throwing fluorocarbon, and a lot of guys are proclaiming that even on their little shallow runners, when they're fishing the flats, they're also using fluorocarbon, which personally a lot of guys disagree with, and along with myself, and there's a big debate going on between these guys. So when you have a big crankbait like so, with a huge long bill that's getting really down deep in the water column, I understand that fluorocarbon is the clear choice for a deep diving crankbait versus it doesn't float, so you have a lot less slack line. You can feel what's really going down there on the bottom. So there's no disagreeing on my part that a deep diving crankbait should be used with fluorocarbon line. Now, when it comes to your shallow running guys, with the little tiny bill, guy runs about a foot or two deep, I personally believe that monofilament is the best choice for this. When you're banging them off, the logs, and the mono's got a lot of spring back. So let's say you're running it in and bam, it hits a log, you get this little spring. Some monofilament lines have 25 to 30% stretch in them. And over 100 foot, I think that's where they're doing the equation. But once you run it into that log, you can pause it at that point. It'll cruise back up and you can pull it back over. It really comes down to your line diameter, more or less. If you were using thin fluorocarbon line, this guy would be running deeper than what it's attuned for out of the box. Say this guy's supposed to be running 2 foot deep and you're using 10-pound fluorocarbon line. He's probably going to be running, instead of 2 foot, you're probably going to be running 3 foot deep over a 100-foot cast. With these guys, I personally believe monofilament is the best choice because mono floats. With the shallow runners, you're visualizing it the whole time. So if you want to fine tune from there and you want it to run a little bit deeper, say you're casting this little guy on 15-pound monofilament line and he's running maybe 6 inches over your target. So instead of throwing 15, if you wanted it to bump that log that's 6 inches lower, downsize to a 12-pound mono, where you get that thinner diameter in the line, and this guy will be able to hoist it down and bump those logs. And with the mono, like I was saying, if you're trying to make that contact, you'll get that little spring back, which will help you over. And your fluorocarbon lines, you don't get the spring. You hit, there's virtually no stretch in fluorocarbon. There's a little bit, but say it hits, and you're pulling right there, your treble hooks might make that contact, and it doesn't give that little hop-up reaction that the mono does, which I personally believe gives you a lot of reaction strikes from those bass. Now, what really comes down is that mid-depth runner. The guy that's running just out of your sight, running maybe 6 to 8 foot deep versus your 10 to 15 foot deep, almost 20. Now these guys, here's the real debate. I personally believe if you're down trying to make some vicious contact with rocks, I say mono's the best choice, a thinner diameter, going with like 12-pound mono instead of 15 or 20 when you want to run it a little bit shallower. By going to that 12, you could still run it deep with that mono, and when you're striking those rocks, you're still going to get that spring, so you're going to get a lot less snags and still cause those reaction bites. Now, if you're fishing a gravel bed, or say a sandy shell bed that's up on a windy point, say where the current's running across, and the bass are going to stack up, I personally believe fluorocarbon's the best choice at that point because you get the sensitivity, you get the feel that you could be pushing through some shell bed, you could feel it dig the bottom, and you're not necessarily requiring that reaction strike, or you don't need that leeway of when the crankbait's bouncing off the rock to get back over the top versus the shell bed. You want to drag it down into there. So personally, I believe fluorocarbon's your best choice at that point. Why I said with the real deep divers like this, why I say go fluorocarbon all the time is because generally when you're fishing really deep, even when you do have that mono and you would want to bounce off those rocks, you're hardly ever going to feel it because you're fishing so deep, you're making long casts to get that crankbait down, you're not going to get that sensitivity, so you probably wouldn't know you were striking the rocks in the first place. And on the really long casts when these guys are running really deep, fluorocarbon does have a very little tiny bit of stretch, and I personally believe when this is deeper, it's filling that void that mono would give you with that big bounce back. You're getting just enough, and plus you got the big bill to avoid those rocks from getting stuck. So Your big deep diving crankbaits, fluorocarbon all the way. Your medium diving, you know, your 8-10 foot range, it's really up to you. If you're hitting those big rocks and you want to get that bounce off and that stretch, you know, give you that leeway and that reaction strike, I say monofilament in a thinner diameter. If you're going for a gravel bed or, you know, a point out there that doesn't have those big rocks and doesn't have those trees, definitely fluorocarbon, because you get that sensitivity and that feel. When you're fishing your shallow runners, I don't see there's any point at all by using fluorocarbon line. I say monofilament, just adjust your diameter to make that slight depth change. A lot of people will say, you know, fluorocarbon's gonna give you the depth change. Not as much as going down, you know, versus 14 pound to 10 to 12 to 15. By jumping around, even in your mono, it's going to give you a much different depth range, and you'll be able to visually adjust on these smaller flat running guys. I'm Nick the Informative Fisherman, and that's the debate between crankbaits and the line choice. We'll see you next time.